Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this, our latest EPRS Roundtable. It's a book talk, and we're going to be talking this afternoon about this book, El Parlamento Europeo, una experiencia única, which has been published by Professor Juan Fernando López Aguilar, better known, of course, here in the European Parliament in his capacity as chair of the Civil Liberties and Justice and Home Affairs Committee, an academic of distinction in his own right, one of several books that he's published on institutional and political questions, and not only a member of the European Parliament since 2009, but also before that, a member of the Spanish Parliament from 2000 to 2009, and during that period served as Minister of Justice in Spain. And he's written this book really from the dual perspective of a European parliamentarian and a former national parliamentarian to ask the question, what is the European Parliament as a political institution? How does it fit into the wider EU system? But how does it relate to issues of participation, accountability, democracy more generally, in a context in which, of course, institutions have never been as challenged as they are today in our democratic history? And after talking a little bit about his book, why he wrote it, what his principal messages are, and how he feels that it can contribute positively to the debate, which of course is now widening rapidly with the new conference on the future of Europe, he will be joined by a very distinguished panel: Enrique BARÓN CRESPO, former president of the European Parliament, Richard Corbett, also a former member of the European Parliament and also an advisor to Herman Van Rompuy when he was president of the European Council, and an author himself of a book in 9 editions, I think, on the European Parliament, and Cristina ROTAECHE, Professor of Public International Law and International Relations and EU Law at the Comillas Pontifical University in Spain. Welcome to you all today. Thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure. And the conversation after Mr. López Aguilar has spoken will be moderated by my colleague Jutta Schulze-Hollmann, who's Director of Resources here in the European Parliamentary Research Service. So really, without further ado, over to Mr. López Aguilar to talk a little bit about his book, and I strongly recommend it to you. It can be borrowed from the European Parliament Library, and of course it's available in all good bookshops, digitally or physically. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Anthony. Good morning, everybody, and I cannot thank you enough for attending this open conversation, which I hope it'll be for some use. I would like especially to appreciate and thank dearly Richard, Cristina, and Enrique, who will be joining soon, for honoring me with this exchange of views on an essay on the European Parliament. Well, first of all, I would like to make it clear and state it clear that I'm a passionate of this European Parliament. I love this European Parliament. I find it a fascinating place ever since I landed here. I had the previous experience of being a member of a regional parliament and being a member of a national parliament. A mandate in opposition as Shadow Minister for Justice and Home Affairs, and a mandate as Minister myself. Then I moved to this European Parliament just to learn that this is a place to be. This is the place I wanted to be, because this is a truly thrilling kind of a place. First of all, it is a parliament, that's for sure, and it's never been a parliament in such a truly and profound way in the meaning of its content as it has been the case ever since the Lisbon Treaty entered into force, along with the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Because in my view, the Lisbon Treaty and the Charter of Fundamental Rights, after a protracted constitutional cycle that started by the beginning of the century, by the turn of the century actually, out of the insufficiencies, the so-called insufficiencies of the Treaty of Nice, all the way to the constitutional treaty that stuck in the referendums of the Netherlands and France and made it to finalize its way to entry into force under the shape of the Lisbon Treaty, the European Parliament has grown to a maturity phase in which it has turned out to be a truly lawmaking body. And I insist always, whenever I have the chance to engage in talks in my academic life before students, but not only before students, before all of the visitors that we've had all of these years, as under the format of the visitors groups, that this European Parliament is now a lawmaking body. It's not a deliberative house. It's not a house meant to discuss of whatever outside. It's a house meant to make laws which are binding for the member states, which are subject to the claims of the European citizens before the European Court of Justice. Law which is guaranteed in its primacy and direct effect by the European Court of Justice. So it's a great leap forward. And it is especially the case in the field of action in which I have been most concentrated, area of liberty, justice, and security, which in my view is the ultimate expression of the constitutional dimension and the political dimension of this maturity phase of the European Parliament. Was not always the case. We all know that at the outset of the process of supranational integration, the European Parliament was a house of secondary election or secondary representation, just as the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe happens to be by now. But it's been 40 years now that it's been directly elected by the European citizens in all of the member states. And throughout this process of enlargement, in which the European Union has grown from its original shape of 6 founding member states to the current state of 27, we miss you so much, number 28, UK, Richard, we still miss you so much in every possible way. Throughout this process of growth of the supranational integration, the European Parliament for 40 years has been the sole institution in the European architecture which is legitimized directly by the universal suffrage of all of the European citizens, growing in numbers, as it was growing in numbers the range of states which are on board of this supranational integration. It means a lot. It means that the European Parliament is somehow the democratic legitimizing motor of the European process, that the European Parliament is the reassurance of the link between the supranational integration and European citizens, and the European Parliament accounts for the fundamental rights of the citizens as it has become a fundamental rights lawmaker. A lawmaker with an impact on fundamental rights. It has been the case in my experience as chair of the LIBE committee when we, for instance, we adopted the data protection package. For the first time ever, we saw that an organic law adopted in Spain protecting data protection, dealing with data protection, was somehow overrun by the European Parliament's legislation, by the European Parliament piece of legislation enacted by the European Parliament, adopted by the European Parliament, with a direct impact on national laws, even dealing with fundamental rights, even in those constitutional dispensations, as it is the case of Spain, in which fundamental rights are the realm of a specific source of law that we call a qualified source of law, we call in Spain organic laws. But the point is that after all of these years, it has been my evidence, at times a sad evidence, that yes, in Spain there is a huge literature on the European Union. There are treaties, there are books, and with chapters devoted to the institutional architecture of the European Union, but not actually a monography in Spanish, explaining what's the European Parliament, what's the uniqueness of the European Parliament in the European Union architecture, what is the role of the European Parliament, how is it elected, what's the mandate of the single member of parliament, the so-called single MEP. Which are the prerogatives of the single MEP, and from which exact point of time are they effective in legal terms? What is the structure of the European Parliament? What is the Bureau and the presidency of the European Parliament? What's the Conference of Presidents? What's the Conference of Committee Chairs? What are and which are the political groups that give account of the pluralism, of the political pluralism and the pluralistic landscape of the representation of the European social fabric, which is, of course, by all means, a natural dimension of every parliament worth of the name. And how do we make laws here? What's the legislative procedure? Which are the specific dimensions of the legislative procedure dealing with the budgetary powers, and when it comes to setting up the so-called multi-annual financial framework, which is bound to have a huge impact on fields of action that for long were the sovereign competences of the member states, but they are no longer so. Making the point in every chapter that for long, member states were on their own on a number of issues. Not anymore, ever since the Lisbon Treaty entered into force along with the Charter, and the European Parliament is there to stay as a true law-making body of the European decision-making process. How to explain this labyrinthic decision-making process in a way that is to be understood in Spanish, of course, appreciating all of the comparative legal references, theoretical references at disposal in a variety of languages, as it is notably the case of the European Parliament by Richard Corbett, Jacobs, and Shackleton, which is a classic we have all read and appreciated. But to somehow divert into Spanish the understanding of the uniqueness of the European Parliament and make it under the parameter of comparative constitutionalism. That has been the aim that has encouraged me to put in writing a number of experiences that I have had throughout all of these years. Yes, it is also true that in comparative constitutional analysis, the same way that there are no federal systems equal to each other, identical to each other, but there is a federalistic pattern under which you may make a comparison between different federalistic experiences. You might also argue that there are no two parliaments which are identical in the range, in the scope of European comparative parliamentarism. I have written also extensively about comparative parliamentarism. But the point I'm making here is that the European Parliament, in many ways, is very unique, and it has to be explained as a unique institution in comparative analysis, particularly when it comes, in my view, to the relevance of the individual member of parliament. The legislative procedure and the parliamentary dynamics in the European Parliament enhance more than any national parliament, to my knowledge, the individual initiative, capacity, political will, even leadership of the individual member of parliament. And that is something extremely stimulating for a member of parliament, as me, as Richard has been, as Enrique BARÓN has been, as so many of us, many attending this open conversation. And that is a factor that, in my view, had to be highlighted and explained properly. Not only when it comes to dynamics, the possibility of having the floor through the so-called blue cards, through the so-called catch the eye, but also through the dynamics of every relevant committee out of the 21 committees of which this house consists of. we do have an individual capacity to make a difference, particularly when it comes to lawmaking, by taking seriously the role of the rapporteur or shadow for a particular piece of legislation, because it is up to the rapporteur and the negotiating team, which consists of the rapporteur and the shadows representing every political group, to somehow figure out and build up the strategy to lead that piece of legislation all the way to the score, to the final vote, for it to enter into force. And then, particularly in the trilogue, to represent the European Parliament's negotiating mandate before the Council as co-legislator with the European Parliament on equal footing. And then there was also the point of explaining how are we elected, comparing all of the variations of the national legislations at site, but putting those all together in a representative house which is directly elected and which animates, invigorates on a daily basis the political pluralism of the European social fabric. And a special chapter devoted to those external dimensions of the European Parliament, caring about fundamental rights, caring about human rights, not only worldwide, but also within the European Union, caring about parliamentary diplomacy, caring about electoral missions, and engaging in lively talks with other parliaments through the so-called interparliamentary conferences, particularly in the field of action of the committee I chair, Liberty, Justice, and Home Affairs. All those issues needed to be somehow thoroughly explained, chapter by chapter, in a book that I was seeking for and somehow expecting for the right moment to put it in writing. And the right moment came with that terrible lockdown that we had to endure through this pandemic and the COVID situation that has been so much prolonged and so much detrimental in every possible way for the European momentum. We are only waiting, and we cannot wait to see it relaunched. And it seems that finally we haven't light at the end of the tunnel. And I'm saying this not only because I took the time when I was locked out, 3 months locked out at home with my family, finding finally some time to put it in writing, but also because I have to reckon that interpretation of the magnitude and the thrill and the allure of the European Parliament is somehow out of touch for all too long. It's been more than 1 year that we are missing that thrill of the lively, hectic and frantic rhythm of the European Parliament because of the impact of the pandemic. So I only hope that all of that energy that I have put into calling for the attraction that this European Parliament deserves can actually make it to break the spell, the curse on the European Parliament, which is not a democratic deficit, as I have heard so much. It's been democratically elected for 40 years now, which is not a competence deficit. We are a lawmaking body for some 10 years now, more than ever before, but for some 40 years in a number of competences we have been making laws. No, the true deficit of this European Parliament is a communication deficit to reach out to the public we represent, because we have never been efficient. We have never made it good enough to make ourselves visible and heard of. So I'm only longing for the moment in which we can actually again gain momentum, maybe through the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is the last chapter as to its dimension on the political core of the European Parliament, Spitzenkandidat, legitimizing the Commission, exerting the parliamentary scrutiny on the Commission, the parliamentary control on the Commission, maybe throughout the conference on the future of Europe, we may also, again, gain momentum to reach out to the public we represent. I only hope that I have been some contribution to reach out to that public by publishing this book and sharing it to the conversation with you. Thank you so much, with all of my heart. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Enrique, when you're there. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much indeed. That was a wonderful, tremendously spirited and enthusiastic introduction. I just remind those who are online, we're over 60 at the moment, that this is the book we're talking about, El Parlamento Europeo, una experiencia única, which Professor, and perhaps we know you more as Mr. here in the European Parliament, Juan Fernando López Aguilar has put together as his lockdown project, really. And it's so interesting that all around Europe we're seeing some positive output, some positive consequences, at least, of the lockdown in terms of people writing and in the artistic world more generally producing very interesting and exciting new products. So thanks so much for that. And I'm now going to pass over the baton over to our moderator for the ensuing discussion, who is Jutta Schulze-Hollmann, who works in the European Parliamentary Research Service and is our Director for Resources. Over to you, Jutta.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. A warm welcome to our panelists and the audience. Muchas gracias, Mr. López Aguilar. I must say I was really impressed by the enthusiasm and by the energy that came across. And I really do hope that you talk to a lot of young people about the European Parliament everywhere in Europe and fill them with this enthusiasm and certainly lots of positive thinking in times which are definitely cumbersome, in times where we're just exiting a type of crisis we all didn't really expect. I have the pleasure to, first of all, introduce in a little bit more detail our distinguished panelists. We're still waiting for Enrique Baron CRESPO to join us. I hope he will in a moment. Meanwhile, Richard Corbett, you don't need any introduction, but I nonetheless wish to mention a little bit more detail that, of course, you've been twice member of the European Parliament for a total of almost 20 years. In between, you've been, as Anthony mentioned already, the advisor to Herman van Rompuy, the, of course, first ever permanent president of the European Council. You're also a colleague, you're EU civil servant, and of course an academic. And you've authored and co-authored many books on EU institutional issues, amongst which the European Parliament, the standard book to look at for anyone who wishes to pass an EU competition. And I know now we have the Spanish version of it, so that's really excellent news. And I know, Richard, that you're following very closely, of course, in these days, the Conference on the Future of Europe, which has just been launched. So many thanks for connecting with us today and being here. Professor Cristina GORTÁZAR, I hope my pronunciation is acceptable. You're Professor of Public International Law, European Law and International Relations at the Pontificia Comillas University in Madrid. You hold a Jean Monnet Chair in European Law, and you've held indeed numerous posts at your university, amongst which that of Vice Rector. You have widely published, notably in the fields of asylum and immigration. Many thanks, Professor GORTÁZAR, to be with us as well. And I'd like to launch the discussion, of course, by focusing on what happened just 48 hours ago in Strasbourg, and I'm sure we all followed it, the long-awaited kickoff of the Conference on the Future of Europe. And we know that an incredible 92% of European citizens across all member states wish that the voices of citizens should be taken more into account when we focus on the future of Europe. This is a very strong statement. And Richard Corbett, you're the expert in this area. What are your expectations? What can we hope for? And what notably can the citizens hope for? Thank you.
First, may I just say a few words to my friend Juan Fernando for making a superb effort in writing that book. As somebody who has also written books on the European Parliament. I know how much work is involved with that. It's a terrific amount that needs to be done. And to have done it as well in opening it to the Spanish language is a great accomplishment. But even more, I think Juan Fernando brings something I could never bring, his experience of having been a national parliamentarian as well as a European parliamentarian and indeed a minister. So he's seen parliaments at work in all their diversity and their different ways of working. Because he's quite right to say that all parliaments are unique. They're all different from each other. But the European Parliament is nonetheless special in a number of ways. First, of course, and obviously, the degree of cultural diversity. As a member, you learn something new every day from your colleagues from Finland, from Greece, from Spain, from Ireland, whatever. It's a wonderful place of exchange and learning. But also because, unlike many national parliaments, the European Parliament is not a rubber stamp for the executive. Many national parliaments, the government, through the parliamentary majority that is committed to it, in fact dictates the legislation that goes through. In the country I know best, which is sadly no longer in the European Union, normally as soon as the government publishes a bill, a draft legislation, you know what the outcome is going to be. They'll have a good debate on it, yeah, fine, but they won't change it. Amendments that defeat the government are headline news. They are so infrequent. Shock, horror, the government has been defeated. Oh. But in the European Union, a draft for legislation that comes from the Commission really is a first draft. It gets reshaped, it gets reworked, it gets amended by the MEPs in a three-layered process, really, of explanation, persuasion, and negotiation. Within your groups, I and Juan Fernando were within the same political group, the Socialists. We had to explain, persuade, negotiate to find a common group position. Then we had to explain, persuade, and negotiate with other groups to find a Parliament position. And then Parliament and the Council had to negotiate to find the final outcome. So the EU is very rich in talking things through. Parler, Parlement, what parliaments were supposed to be about, but so many of them have forgotten their origins because they just vote dutifully for whatever the government wants. I'm exaggerating slightly to make my point, but I think you will understand it. Now, I used to think that the European Parliament was good at that, but lacked perhaps the theatre and the drama of debate that you get, at least in the House of Commons. I've revised my opinion of that. I've seen that the House of Commons debates are very much yah, boo, two sides yelling at each other with no real debate to find a compromise. Whereas in the European Parliament, the debates are aimed at that, and they have become more lively over the years. Juan Fernando mentioned the blue card, the catch the eye procedure. I was the rapporteur who introduced those into the rules of procedure. Things have got a little bit better. So on that front as well, I think we can be proud of the European Parliament. And Juan Fernando is quite right to bring so much passion to it. It's also unique in, of course, that it has evolved. Many national parliaments are set in long-established constitutions that are fixed or more or less fixed. The European Parliament has been in an evolving constitutional situation. Just over 20 years ago, it was an advisory body when it came to legislation. Commission proposed, Parliament would debate, give an opinion, and the decision was in the hands of the Council. Now, hardly any European legislation can be adopted without the approval of the Parliament. The budget can't be adopted, the multi-annual financial framework, international agreements, the appointment of the Commission, the choice of the President of the Commission, and other things all require the explicit approval of the European Parliament. That has transformed the situation, though there is a time lag in public perceptions. The old idea that it's not really a parliament, the idea that it doesn't have the right of initiative, though it does, under the treaty, have the right to request the Commission to draft legislation. All this lingers in the public opinion. But gradually public opinion is, I think, catching up. And to come to your question, belatedly, the Conference on the Future of Europe, which is the biggest exercise of consulting the public that the European Union has ever engaged with, outside of elections, of course, because the elections to the European Parliament are still the biggest. This exercise, I hope, will have spin-off in that the European Parliament's role will be better understood. But it will also be an opportunity to gather ideas together and see what demands the public has for where the European Union goes forward. Perhaps in terms of policies, what things should we do at European level that we're not doing now, what things at the European level could be left to the national level. But especially the capacity of the Union to deliver. If we are going to do things at European level jointly, and we agree that, then you need to give the Union the capacity. Executive capacity in the Commission, capacity to actually take decisions in the legislature, that I'm thinking of the Council, where it makes no sense to ask the European Union to act and then paralyze it by giving a veto to every single minister around the table. It makes no sense to have vetoes on common policies that you have all decided should be common policies. And if you are increasing the capacity of the Union to function, you must then look again at its democratic accountability. And that means, again, looking at the role of the parliaments to see where it can still be strengthened. Juan Fernando is right to say that the democratic deficit has gone in the original sense of the word, that the national parliaments had given powers to the European Union, but the European parliaments didn't have the powers. It does now. There is still a problem of distance, of course, unavoidably. You don't want to do things at European level if you can do them perfectly well at national level. But because we do want to, most of us, do things together at European level, need to do things together at European level if we're going to be effective, you need to make sure that that is in the context of an institutional system that can deliver and is democratically accountable. That's the challenge for the Conference on the Future of Europe.
Thank you very much indeed for reminding us, first of all, of the long and successful journey the European Parliament has already undertaken, and indeed give us your assessment of the potential of the Conference on the Future, which, as we know, has just been launched. Professor GORTÁZAR, I was quite intrigued when I looked at your various publications, and I saw you also published about something called reconceptualization of the European citizenship. That is of course, we all know this, the European citizenship as a concept that stems from the Maastricht Treaty, has been further developed. Maybe you can explain to us in a little bit more detail how you see this instrument and how it links now to the ongoing consultation, wide consultation of citizens across the EU. Many thanks.
Can you hear me properly? Yes? Okay. So first of all, thank you very much to all of you for inviting me to participate in this open conversation. I'm first of all going to answer to Jutta regarding reconceptualization of citizenship, of European citizenship. This is a book we research about first on a research program of European Jean Monnet Action or whatever, through three Jean Monnet professors, because we had the idea, we continue having the idea that this work that the European Court of Justice is always doing regarding many issues. I mean, focus, for instance, on the area of freedom, security, and justice, and in particular regarding third country nationals, has to do with a kind of reconceptualization through jurisprudence of the European Court. I'm not very sure if we should be so enthusiastic of these reconceptualizations through the European Court nowadays, currently, but this is a work we've done between 2010 and 2012, and we really gather a group of articles of very good experts in European law, and I think the total work is quite interesting. And of course, the issue is that currently, if you finish a book 10 years ago or 9 years ago, you always think that you need to rewrite it to be not to be obsolete or whatever. No? Regarding the book that I read with the great interest of Juan Fernando López Aguilar, I want to say that I'm so honored to be here. I want to tell Professor López Aguilar that my students will work on his book next academic course, because I found that the basic ideas of the European Parliament, that certainly I agree with Professor López Aguilar that the deficit of the European Parliament is not a democratic deficit, but probably it's quite a communication deficit. How the co-legislation, which is well known after the Lisbon Treaty in so many areas, and the work of an institution that co-legislate, and that is so important in the representation of the European public opinion, needs to be studied, and the book is very clear, you know, and the book has the passion that Juan Fernando López Aguilar puts in everything he does. Okay, so it's a great honor. I want to stress some ideas of the book, just to discuss with you, and especially, of course, with Juan Fernando López Aguilar. I've been impressed by the first part of the book, in which Professor López Aguilar stressed that there is no standard for a process of integration. There's no standard at all. So it is for nothing that we, well, not myself, but some European experts are at the debate of if or is a federal procedure or not a federal procedure or whatever. Juan Fernando López Aguilar explains perfectly that the federalizing process or the integration, the constitutional integration process, is not at all, has no label. So the issue for us is that our process, our constitutional integration cycle, is that we have developed a constitutional pleiade code of principles and values that are the cornerstone of the European law, and then that are have been codified by Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, after being at the Copenhagen criteria since 1993. But currently, from Lisbon Treaty onwards, we have our code of principles and value, the rule of law, the separation of powers, the independence of the judicial power, and certainly the inviolability of our own freedoms and rights. So then Fernando López Aguilar goes to another idea related with this idea, which is stop talking on what's the culture, the European culture. What's the European culture? Is it the Greco-Latin culture? Is it the Christian in what it is? Our culture, our constitutional values. So the European culture is the rule of law and the protection of human rights. And of course, the plurality of political parties and democracy in the whole term of democracy, etc. So then there is also something that I've read with pleasure, with intense pleasure, which is something that we internationalists, we discuss a lot, which is the intersystematical relationship between the European Union law and the member states' legal orders. So we've been for decades speaking on dualistic theories, monistic theories, etc. And Juan Fernando López Aguilar explained there is a new concept of relationship between European Union law and the legal orders of member states. And this relationship is as new as we cannot emphasize on supremacy of the European law, but primacy of the European law, as we all know. And this primacy of the European law is nothing more than a coordination between legal orders under this primacy in order to apply all the other principles as applicability, effectiveness, etc. So it is not a question of hierarchy. It is a question of a necessary relation of primacy on the side of European law. And this is especially difficult in countries like Spain, for example. We have had a lot of uncomfortable sensation with some of the resolutions of the Court of Justice regarding Spanish issues. Juan Fernando, remember all along his book, some different situations or cases against, or not against, but just preliminary rulings. I can remember now the case of Junqueras. Junqueras is a Spanish independent candidate, Catalan independence leader who was appointed in 2019 as a member of the European Parliament while he was in provisional prison in Spain because of the process, of the Catalan process. And the preliminary ruling gave an answer to Spain telling that he could be under provisional prison and be elected as a member of the European Parliament. And this has been an issue, a very hot issue for Spaniards, because sometimes we think that this is submission, and this is not submission, but coordination with the rule of primacy, if I have understood the ideas developed here in this part of the book by Juan Fernando López Aguilar. Then I have two words, because I know I would like to explain many things about the book, but I would like to go to some issues related with chapter 5, which is the chapter of my specialty on the area of freedom, security, and justice, which, as Juan Fernando López Aguilar says, it is a very good example of the increasing legislative powers of the European Parliament that has increased these powers throughout all the reforms of the constitutional treaties, and very importantly through the Lisbon Treaty. So in this chapter, I would like to share some questions with Juan Fernando López Aguilar. Some of them, in some of them, I've seen that Juan Fernando López Aguilar has the same ideas that I have. I mean, for example, I think that the European Parliament has a pending task on it to continue with the task in this chapter, to try to push the Commission in order to open legal pathways for people trying to ask for international protection. And Juan Fernando López Aguilar devote a part to the necessity, for instance, to create, after the case of XX versus Belgium, etc., to create a real European framework in order to have the humanitarian visa under the umbrella of European Union law, humanitarian visa in order at the embassies, consulates, or even, of course, the European Union delegations to ask for a visa in order to ask for international protection inside Europe. This is necessary because there are no other ways to ask, there are no easy ways to ask for international protection when people is at risk out of a safe zone, a safe region. Then another pending task is to clarify more than it is clarified already, the safe European harbor in the cases of disembarkation from the Mediterranean, along with a clarification, a more clear definition of the descriminalization, I think it's decriminalization of the humanitarian safe and rescue at the Mediterranean. We have had, and we have, a very hot issue with this now in the Canary Islands. We have had a lot in Italy, Greece, and continue having a lot of on these differences regarding the legal orders that they, for instance, are not in line or not totally in line with this no criminalization of humanitarian smuggling, when it is really humanitarian smuggling and the consequence of safe and rescue. And then I want to ask something to Professor, the honorable member of the European Parliament, which is regarding the role of the European Parliament and the readmission agreements. I mean, I know the readmission agreement of irregular migrants is a competence of the European Union, and therefore a shared competence for this international agreement of the Parliament. But it is very tricky because since it is a power of the Union and a power in co-legislation, the Council and the Parliament, since it is this in this manner, since the Lisbon Treaty onwards, what it has been increasing a lot are the informal framework collaboration agreement with third countries of origin and transit of migrants. And in these informal agreements, which is part of the externalization of the external dimension of the European Union politics on immigration and asylum. In this informalization, the European Parliament has no role at all. So for me, it's very demanding in the part of the Parliament to ask for explanation for this huge amount of informal agreements which are not under the rule of law, or could be not under the rule of law, and it's so difficult to monitorize from the point of view of human rights. So regarding the conference of the future of Europe, I expect that it could be a good forum to discuss on Article 2 and Article 7 in practice of the Treaty of the European Union, because as far as my students, sometimes they ask for what about Article 7, it's really impossible to apply. And we have very bad, in practice, very bad examples of behavior of some of our neighbors, or I mean of European member states, regarding the risk vis-a-vis of Article 2. Article 7 is so difficult to apply that probably inside this conference we need to discuss in practice how to change this article in order to be more secure of application of our constitutional principles and values that are under Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. Sorry if I exceed my time, because my English is not as fluent as yours, and I try to do my best. Thank you.
No problem. Many thanks, Professor. No problem whatsoever. And thank you for your reflections through your legal eye, and also focusing on the area of migration, where I suppose many citizens would agree that we do still have open questions, and a genuine, coherent response by the EU is still due. Before giving the floor back to Mr. López Aguilar, I would like to encourage our entire audience to use the chat, please. And Mr. López Aguilar, I have a message for you from your colleague Margarida Marquez. She would like to congratulate you to the book. I understood she had to now join a meeting. And we will hear in a moment from Mr. Ruiz de Besa, who I understand is still connected and would like to address also a question to you. But Mr. López Aguilar, you first wish to react, I'm sure. Thank you.
To both Cristina and Richard for the points they have made. Waiting for Enrique Barón, whom I talked to a while ago. He was in another meeting, in another video conference meeting of some foundation of which happens to be a member. But I wanted, of course, to appreciate the very fact that both Richard and Cristina have dwelled on points that I have tried to explain and elaborate through the chapters of the book, and would be impossible for me to introduce in this open conversation without escaping its very point, its very object, which is precisely to submit it to a discussion, and if the case might be, to criticism. But I wanted to simply make it clear that that special, unique nature, capacity, and internal structure of the European Parliament, when you approach it from the comparative constitutional analysis point of view, which is my discipline, which is my specialty as professor of comparative law and constitutional law, then you realize that the procedure and the structure of the internal of the European Parliament is meant precisely to make a huge difference as to most national parliaments, precisely under this comparative approach. Most of national parliaments are somehow an expression of what has been called in the comparative doctrine structured parliamentarism, which is a parliamentarism in which the parliament is so tightly subject to written law and to the procedures that are subject to the majority rule, which is to support the cabinet, the government, the council of ministers in office precisely on the grounds of the so-called bond of trust between the parliament and the cabinet, what is called in Italian relazione fiduciaria, the Treue zwischen der Europäischen Parlament und der Regierung, the trust between the parliament and the government, which has been explained by Richard CORBETT, makes it so predictable how the parliament is going to behave, how initiatives are going to be dealt with. Those initiatives, those bills which are to be filed by the government are to make it, and those bills which are to be filed by the opposition or the minority parties are never going to make it. This is not the point in the European Parliament. The European Parliament is an open-ended process in which nothing is written in the outset. It depends precisely on the strategy and the capacity, individual capacity of the negotiating team of the European Parliament, the rapporteurs and the shadows, to build up a majority and to make it happen. It may happen, it may not, but nothing is written, precisely because there is not a written shape of relationship between majorities and minorities in the European Parliament. There is a variable geometry of majorities and minorities which are always changing in its scope, in its internal composition, and in its aim. So there might be a progressive majority for a certain file, a pro-European majority for another file, a conservative majority for another file, but it's never written in the outset. That is what makes precisely the European Parliament experience such a thrilling experience for one who loves parliamentarism in its very content, which is precisely to engage in eye contact, in a personal negotiation, in a permanent tug of war, building up on a daily basis the compromise of culture and the culture of compromise, which is precisely the point in the European Parliament. Everything is subject to a compromise. And the compromise is the way in which European Parliament happens to make decisions. Compromising. To understand that is to understand the European Parliament. And it's not that easy for someone who comes from a national parliament experience, because in the national parliament, everything is written from the outset. If you belong to the majority which supports the government, you are to counter the minority initiatives by all of your means, in every way, with no concessions. But in the European Parliament, right from the very first minute, you have to make up your mind that you will have to compromise to make things happen. That is the interest. That is the point. And I thank you so much for having stressed these issues in both in the area of liberty, justice, and security, and when it comes to an understanding of the European experience, as the case of Richard CORBETT, we have shared so many thrilling moments, and I hope good memories for the rest of our lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. López Aguilar. I hear that Enrique Baron Crespo has had technical problems, but seems to be connected now. Don't know, Mr. Baron Crespo, whether you... That's wonderful.
I apologize. This is the third webinar I have today. I have still 3 others. I have always problems with the webinars of the European Parliament. This must be a part of our habitudes. So I'm so sorry, but I'm late. But I want to first to welcome the effort of Juan Fernando López Aguilar is, well, an old and close friend. But moreover, he has made a very interesting work, not only as a professor, as an academician, but as an European. Why? Because you know, to go to the European Parliament is to go to the school for every European. Because in the schools, we learned that our neighbors were enemies, that we were the best of the world, that we had to fight each other. And when you go to the European Parliament, well, you see that these women and men, you share a lot of values, you share your future, and you learn to live together. And this is the reason why this kind of effort, like the book that has written Juan Fernando, well, for me is a very interesting tool. When I arrived in the European Parliament, I had no handbook. I gave to my team the Mémoire aux Jean Monnet. Very interesting, as a tool. But I think that well, this is a good effort, and I'm ready if you have questions to comment and to answer. Yeah. Do you hear me?
Many thanks, Mr. Baron Crespo. It's wonderful that you could join us lately, so a warm welcome to you as well. I will, for our audience, I will nonetheless introduce you a little bit more in detail. Of course, everyone knows that you have been the President of the European Parliament at a pivotal moment, I would say, in the history of the EU, namely from 89 to 92. You have also been twice the chair of a committee, namely that of Foreign Affairs and the International Trade Committee. You have a background as economist and lawyer, and indeed a PhD in economics and law. And you hold currently, which some of our audience may not know, a Jean Monnet chair ad personam at the University of Castilla-La Mancha. Again, welcome. We will continue our chat. If you allow, please signal if you wish to come back in. We had tried to upgrade, as one says technically, a Member of Parliament, Mr. Dominic Ruiz de Vesa. Mr. Ruiz de Vesa, you are now a so-called panelist in our digital language, but I can't see whether you have switched on either your camera or your microphone. Could you try to do that so that you could present yourself, your comment and or question? As I think I hear from the technical angels behind the screen that there seems to be a problem. So I'm reading it out to you, Mr. López Aguilar. So the comment, first of all, says, congratulations. What else do we need to make the EP more powerful? Question mark. Right of inquiry, right of initiative, co-decision on taxation and own resources. Could the EP be in the main driver, I suppose it means in the driving seat, for a more federal union in the Conference on the Future of Europe, and thus for a new treaty? So we have here a whole basket of questions. Please, over to you, Mr. López Aguilar.
Thank you for the question. You know, I have a mind frame which is hard to escape, actually impossible to escape. I'm a constitutional professor, constitutional law professor, which means that I am well aware that constitutionalism is about limiting power instead of enlarging, enhancing, widening power. Is precisely about framing power. It's about limiting power by law, which means that I wouldn't dream of making the European Parliament more powerful. I think it is powerful enough. I think maybe of making it more efficient in exerting its competences and make it more visible and better known by the European citizens we do represent. I find it painful every time that we've had elections to see that ever since the democratically elected composition of the European Parliament was secured more than 40 years ago now, the electoral turnout has been in decline up until 2019, in which we broke the spell. Somehow we broke the spell. We somehow rebounded again on the rise with an increasing electoral turnout, which is very good news. But we gotta do better so that we somehow engage the European citizens in every electoral process so that they make their choice as to the composition of the European Parliament, and the awareness and the knowledge that the European Parliament makes a real impact on their everyday life in every possible way. The European Parliament makes laws on fundamental rights. The European Parliament makes laws on the budget, which is binding for the member states. When it comes to the so-called expenditure ceiling by the multi-annual financial framework, the European Parliament has a say whenever there is an international agreement or treaty negotiated by the European Union in all, particularly when it comes to commercial treaties. The European Parliament's the final say, and if we don't say yes, that international agreement will not enter into force. That's real power, but we gotta make it visible so the European citizens get to know about it. How to make it more efficient? Improving our parliamentary scrutiny on the Commission. We have a legitimizing power, that's for sure. Even stronger and more powerful than many national parliaments in a way, because we do not only legitimize the man or woman who is to preside over the European Commission, which is the permanent executive of the European architecture, of the European institutional architecture, but we do also legitimize every individual member of the College of the Commission, every individual members, by a preliminary exam, which is the hearing of the commissioners before the relevant committees. We do have the decisive power to make a candidate to be a member of the College of Commissioners step down before he or she is ever being given the chance to actually perform its duties in his or her portfolio. That is a relevant power. But how could we improve our parliamentary scrutiny in the Commission? By setting forth an institutional question time, as it is the case in classical national parliaments. Of course, that's the case of the classical Westminster parliamentarism type. Question time, so we can shoot directly, orally, our questions to the individual members of the College of Commissioners, and shoot at them and try to exert true control, lively control on a regular basis in every plenary session of the European Parliament. That would be an idea. And in my view, it could also help if we parallel the term of the European Parliament with the term of the multi-annual financial framework. In my view, it is a paradox that we have 7th year multi-annual financial frameworks and we have 5 years parliamentary term. We should make them consistent, coincident in time, in the timing, in the time frame, so that we make sure when the European parliaments are called for a European election, that they will be deciding the correlation of forces, majorities and minorities, which will be deciding over the big so-called macro magnitudes, deficit, debt, the euro, the whole thing, depending on the kind of choice you make, man or woman, when you're called for an election of the European Parliament. In my view, that would really help to make it more visible. Not more powerful, not more power. I'm not particularly thrilled about making institutions powerful. I would like to make them efficient and of course accountable, so that if you're not happy with the delivery of a certain institution, then you might change your mind in due time when you're called again for a democratic decision. That's what democracy is about.
Thank you very much for your powerful reply, Professor GORTÁZAR, Richard Corbett. Anything?
That it is not probably necessary to have more powers, but to control or all other political powers vis-a-vis the law.
Richard, I think you're muted, actually. If you could try to unmute. Yes.
Is that better? Yeah. I agree generally with Juan Fernando. The European Parliament now has an almost generalized power of co-decision within the EU system. And it's more really a question of whether the EU as such should have a wider field of competence. Are there more things that we need to be doing together at European level or not? But there are one or two little anomalies. Co-decision doesn't apply in some areas where the Council alone can legislate. That's almost an anomaly now that should be removed. So there's one or two little things like that should be looked at. That doesn't detract from Juan Fernando's main point, but I think it's worth mentioning.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this addition. And sadly, we seem to have lost Mr. Baron CRESPO again. These are modern times. It's easier to get experts on board, but then you also lose them due to digital obstacles that we are all facing. Meanwhile, we have a question from another member, namely Tatiana Zdanoka. She says as well, she had to leave, sorry, that's why I don't even try to invite her technically to present herself. The question, she says, first of all, congratulations on the book launch and apologize that she had to join a meeting now. Is it possible to progress with the rule of law without changing Article 51? I throw the question in the round.
Progress in the rule of law. In the rule of law, well, I mean, that's the conference on the future of the European Union is not meant to result into institutional reform, but it's hard to avoid that eventually we will have to come again to a serious thinking of an institutional reform, because the European Union, the European process is an open-ended process. It's always pending of an institutional reform. We have always been pending of an institutional reform to do better. It takes time. It's getting even harder and harder because we have been growing and getting fatter and fatter, wider and wider. So it was easier to have institutional reform when we were 12 or when we were 15, and now that we have been 28 and we happen to be 27 by now. Not easy to come up to institutional reforms, considering that the breaking point is still unanimity. That is not easy, but we might come to the point in which we might take decisions even unanimously as to make institutional reforms. And sometimes some articles should have to be reviewed. The play, it's been noted by Cristina, the kind of game that is played between Articles 2 and 7. Article 7 is one of these clauses of constitutional nature somehow designed not to be ever implemented, not to be ever put in practice. But at times, it happens that you have to. And it happened that we had to set in motion the disposal of Article 7. Not easy, because paragraph 3 says it will require unanimity except being made of those countries concerned by the analysis made by the others, so that we may prevent those countries from voting in the Council. That would be the ultimate sanction, that would be the ultimate, let's say, punishing measure. But in the end, there is a procedure to detect serious breach of a clear risk of a serious breach, clear risk of a serious breach, of a violation of the values. Then it also comes the review procedure. Whenever we think in constitutional thinking, whenever we think in constitutional terms of reviewing some legal document, we have to dwell on the chapter, on the articles precisely devised to activate reform or review of those legal documents, because normally they are the opening key. And it happens that Article 48 of the treaty, which is the article of the Treaty of the European Union, which is the article meant to open the gate for reform, is extremely impractical. That should also be reviewed. And let me be some provocative. Let me share some provocative thinking. I would like your reactions to the matter. I am used, whenever I explain European constitutional issues, I am used to these challenging questions. When, if we are not truly federal, and we are not there yet, when will we discuss about how can we do to expel a member state from the Union? A reluctant, dysfunctional member state, which is in defiance of European law? How can we expel a member that has lacked the political will which is needed to be a reliable partner of this integration process? Well, that's a very challenging question, which is not easy to answer. But of course, there is no legal technique to do that. There is a technique to separate from the rest. Article 50, that was unfortunately the case of the Brexit situation, but not actually an article for somehow putting aside a reluctant, defiant, dysfunctional member. So all of these issues may be subject to discussion, maybe throughout the process that has just been launched under the label of Conference on the Future of the European Union. Maybe your thoughts on the matter? Any comment?
Many thanks. I just mentioned that Mr. Ruiz de Vesa is now amongst the panelists and seems to be able to. Voila, we can see you. Please, you have the floor.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm sorry I had to disconnect for a little bit for another meeting of the S&D group, but I'm glad that the event is still going on. I was able to listen to the first 40 minutes, the entire introduction by Juan Fernando and a little bit from Richard. And I found also that the book is a great contribution that gives us a perspective also on things like are not that I think are known but not so often commented. For example, if you compare us to a standard national parliament, the relevance of the internal events that we used to have, with civil society organizations to promote any sort of initiatives, this is not common, at least not in the Spanish national parliament. Or the fact that in a way, when we look at our resolutions on international affairs, we are a bit of a global parliament, because everyone is looking to what we have to say on Mexico or on China or on Russia or on Eritrea. So this is also not common in a standard national parliament. Maybe the US Congress can play a role comparable to that. Now, my question to Juan Fernando, he emphasizes a lot that since Lisbon, we are a true parliament with legislative powers, and I agree with you. However, it's true we have also some ground to cover, the right of initiative, for instance, the right of inquiry, but also co-decision on some key, well, Richard, of course, can also comment on that by all means. Co-decision on taxation, for example, and on own resources. No, we don't have that. And you know very well, Juan Fernando and Richard, the old Federalist motto. You are both Federalists like myself. The old Federalist motto: no taxation without representation. But it is also said that the opposite must also be true. No representation without taxation. No taxation. Okay, no taxation without representation, and no representation without taxation. Right. So we have representation, but no taxation at the European Parliament. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think, with the Conference on the Future of Europe, we can enhance the power of Parliament in these three domains: initiative, inquiry, and co-decision? Thank you very much.
You have made a number of interesting points, and I thank you for that. That's food for thought, certainly. The first point I would like to share with you is that, according to my knowledge, not only to my knowledge, according to my experience, the ground which is yet to be covered by the European Parliament in order to somehow complete this cycle of becoming that kind of a parliament we have in mind coming from a national experience has something of the kind of a legal bias. By that I mean that, according to my experience, the right of initiative is hardly exerted in any national parliament in which you might shed your sight on or your eyes on. Let's talk of the Spanish Parliament. Does it ever happen that there is such thing as a parliamentary initiative? Almost 100% of the legislative files which make it all the way to the official gazette in Spain do not take origin in some sort of parliamentary initiative. No, they take origin in governmental initiative. More than that, it's been 5 years now or 6 in which 1% of the bills that make it all the way to the National Gazette are through the so-called parliamentary legislative procedure, and 99% are the so-called law decrees, which have been adopted by the government and convalidated by the parliament in Spain. In Spain. So that is something, just I'm just sharing with the attendants of this discussion, just to somehow put it in frame, into a rational frame, this legal point, which is legally biased, of the European Parliament lacking parliamentary initiative. Because parliamentary initiative is hardly the case of the legislation which is adopted in the national dispensations of the member states of the European Union. Most of the legislation which is adopted at the national level has been origined, has been set in motion, not by the parliament, but by the governments. And increasingly the case, adopted by the government by some kind of a decree, then convalidated, or then eventually validated by the parliament. The same goes as to the paradox that has been described: no taxation without representation, and of course no representation without taxation. In Spain, there is a constitutional clause in which the government may block every legislative file which may amount to an increase of the tax pressure without the authorization of the government, or an increase of the expenditure without the authorization of the government. The government may block every initiative that has an impact in the income that is binding according to the effective budgetary law, which is to be adopted annually. It's been some time in which, in Spain, for instance, the budgetary law is not adopted every year on an annual basis, but on the contrary, because of the internal composition of the Spanish Parliament, it's been more and often the case that a budgetary act overarches a number of years in a row instead of being renewed on an annual basis. But the point is that according to the Spanish written constitution, the government may block every act which has a budget, a tax impact in terms of increasing its income or decreasing the national income. That means in practical terms that yes, there is something we could do about making it clear that the European Parliament has a legislative power, including social matters or tax matters. But the difference that it would make as to the way in practice national parliamentarisms do deliver wouldn't be that much of a difference, believe me, according to my comparative analysis. But anyhow, it is true. It is a very valid point that it would be great if we somehow consecrate, if we enshrine in the wording of the treaties of the European Union that we do have taxing power, that we do have social lawmaking power, that we do have legislative initiative. It would be great. Thank you. Thank you for that.
López Aguilar, yeah, it's fascinating to listen to you. I'm terribly sorry, but we have to come to a close. Professor GORTÁZAR just apologized. She had to leave already, had to leave digitally, of course. But maybe we still want to hear a final word from Richard Corbett. Is there something a message or a comment you want to?
Well, I could just say on that point that I agree, Juan Fernando, in practice, national parliaments don't really exercise their right of initiative. The European Parliament, in theory, doesn't have it, but in practice, it does, frequently through initiative reports, and these are usually taken up by the Commission. And indeed, the European Parliament has a right under the treaty, the same right as the Council, by the way, to request the Commission to bring forward legislative proposals. So things aren't so black and white there. And on the budget, you know, when the European Parliament votes any increase in the EU spending, because the budget is balanced by law, it is automatically voting for an increase in the taxation, in the revenue of the European Union. So it does vote increases in taxation. What it doesn't have is the choice of the origin of that taxation, of the type of taxation. The balancing item at the moment is the tax on member states in function of their GNI, the GNI contribution. So it automatically comes from there. And that's what's missing. And there, the big problem is not really that the Parliament has a say or not. The big problem is the need for unanimity, as it is on the problem of member states not respecting the rule of law, as it is on foreign policy decisions, as it is in every area where the EU has to have unanimity within the Council to take a decision. All the crises that we see whenever the EU is in the headlines for a crisis of one kind or another, it's usually because it's an area where you need unanimity and there is deadlock in the Council or the European Council. That is the fundamental problem.
Well, if I may just quickly.
We might be cut off technically, but please, yeah.
No, okay. But the recovery plan is supposed to be paid back by taxes, European taxes on CO2, financial transactions, digital platforms. We cannot accept that Parliament has no say on those pan-European taxes that supposedly are going to be introduced, no?
Yeah, that's why I was saying the problem is you don't have a choice of the type of tax at the moment. You do when you vote in the Parliament on extra spending, you are automatically voting an extra tax of a certain kind within a certain ceiling. But one thing that is lacking is the choice of the type of taxation. I agree on that.
Apologies that we have to close at this moment. I wish to thank all our distinguished guests. It's been fascinating to listen to you and see all the ground you covered. I think there is a consensus that the European Parliament is unique. It has real teeth. It needs to get more lively, but Mr. López Aguilar, you absolutely compensate for the livelihood that we're currently missing. I think everyone will confirm this, and I think we all have very, very high hopes for the conference on the future of Europe.
We need British question time. We need British question time.
I talked about it. I talked about it.
I also need to apologize, but there were further questions in the chat. Maybe we can convey them to you, Mr. López Aguilar, and I wish you all success with your book. Many thanks.
Thank you, Jutta. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Richard, Enrique, everyone who attended this conversation. Thank Cristina, who had to leave. Thank you all. It's been my honor to be part of this gathering, of this conversation. Apropos, as the title of Woody Allen's book, apropos of this, apropos of almost nothing, of this essay, of this attempt of mine to make sense, reaching out to the public, because one thing is sure, is that everyone who has had the experience of the European Parliament knows that it actually makes sense to represent the European citizenship, the European space for citizenship, which is complementary to the national citizenship. It is a way to enrich each other throughout this ongoing dialogue and open conversation. That's what the European Union is about, and I only hope that this conversation, this short-framed conversation, was kind of a metaphor of the experiencing that we have enjoyed all of these years. Thank you so much, wholeheartedly. Thank you so much.
That's a beautiful closing statement, and it was, of course, our pleasure as EPRS to host you. All the very best, and please stay.
Big hug, Richard. Bye. Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Great event. Congratulations.
Thank you.